Joseph Frank Keaton was born into Vaudeville, destined for a life of physical comedy and performance. But it was an incident in his infancy that would define his persona forever. When he was just a toddler, touring with his family's show, The Two Keatons, he took a spectacular tumble down a flight of stairs. It wasn't just a slight fall. It was a full head-over-heels, breathtaking plunge that should have resulted in tears and injury. Instead, the small boy simply picked himself up, brushed himself off, and, reportedly, didn't shed a single tear. Among the astonished onlookers was the famous escape artist Harry Houdini, a family friend who often toured alongside them. Astounded by the boy's resilience and the sheer force of the fall, Houdini immediately exclaimed, "That was a real buster," a slang term for a tremendous high-impact spill. The name stuck, instantly forging an unbreakable link between the man and his on-screen persona. Accidental tumble, witnessed by a master illusionist, launched one of the most iconic careers in cinematic history, built entirely on surviving the impossible physical gag. Given that, could the boy's life have been anything other than a spectacular, perfectly timed calamity? This is the story of Buster Keaton, the Great Stone Face. The man known to history as Joseph Frank Buster Keaton was born on the 4th of October 1895 in the small town of Piqua, Kansas. His father was Joseph Halley Keaton, an Indiana-born Quaker who had escaped his strict Christian upbringing at the age of 26 to pursue his dream of becoming a vaudeville performer. Reaching Oklahoma with nothing but $8 and a Winchester rifle, he met Buster's mother and Iowa native Myra Cutler, a 4'11" whiskey-consuming fiddle player who was the daughter of Frank L. Cutler, the owner of the Cutler Comedy Company. This was a traveling performance show that made most of its money from the drinks it sold to the audience. After being hired by her father, Joseph and Myra struck up an intimate relationship that would eventually result in their marriage on the 31st of May, 1894. Leaving the Cutler Company, the newlyweds scratched out a living as performers. Joseph became best known for an impressive high kick, which could reach 8 feet in the air and which had enough accuracy to knock a man's hat off. 8 months after their wedding, Myra was pregnant. It was while the couple were at Piqua, Kansas, one of the many temporary stops on their tour, that she gave birth to Buster. The first of Keaton's 3 wives was Nathalie Talmadge, the sister of 2 famous actresses. Her compulsive spending and the desire to keep up with the Joneses, which conflicted with her husband's simple ways, would be partly responsible for the breakdown of their marriage. His second wife was May Scriven, a nurse who he wed at the height of his alcoholism. She was accused by some of trying to use his famous name for her own financial gain. Keaton's third wife was Eleanor Norris, who, although 23 years his junior, was, by all accounts, a loyal and loving spouse to him until his final days. His brother was Harry Keaton, nicknamed Jingles for the racket he made with his toys and who made minor, uncredited appearances in some of his older brother's films. His sister was Louise Keaton, who also appeared in a handful of Buster's works as an actress and, during the filming of Steamboat Bill Jr., worked as a stunt double for the swimming scenes. His sons were Jimmy and Bobby Keaton, who, brought up in the period when their father was Hollywood royalty, adored him immensely throughout their lives. After graduating from high school, they both joined the Coast Guard during World War II. Bobby was to lose an earlobe to a German sniper during the war. In appearance, the 5'6" Buster was wiry and acrobatic. These were characteristics that lent themselves well to the dangerous and death-defying stunts he liked to perform for his art. One of his most recognizable features, apart from his iconic expressionless deadpan face, were his unique pork pie flat hats. These he made himself by buying Stetson felt fedoras, removing the lining, punching in the crown, and trimming and flattening the brim. Buster's larger-than-life screen persona did not reflect the real man. He loathed the attention surrounding him and was remarkably shy. On one occasion later in his life, after the showing of a film retrospective of his career, Buster rushed out of the theatre to throw up in a back alley when he saw hordes of fans hurrying towards him. Rather than be the centre of attention, he loved nothing more than playing a few hands of his favourite pastime, bridge, with a couple of his close friends. Straddling the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, just before the advent of film, the most popular form of comedy in America was vaudeville. A typical show of this genre consisted of a variety of unrelated acts featuring everything from contortionists to ventriloquists to puppet shows, singing bartenders, bare-knuckle boxers, and physical comedy routines. It was in this world that Buster Keaton was born. One of his earliest and most defining moments would happen when staying at a theatrical boarding house with his parents. He tripped and fell down a flight of stairs, somehow emerging miraculously uninjured from the tumble. The famous escapologist Harry Houdini had witnessed the fall and was so impressed he picked the child up and exclaimed, "My, what a buster!" with buster referencing the showbiz term for a fall. It would be the first of many such incidents, most of which were exaggerations that would propagate the myth that Buster Keaton was indestructible. In 1899, the Keaton family were not having much luck in the small, poor towns, and so, eager to get their big break, they took the decision to move to New York to chase their dreams. It was there that Joe and Myra would experience moderate success in a series of solo acts they devised themselves, the most successful being The Man with a Table. This act involved Joe doing a series of acrobatic moves around a table while dressed up as a clown, with Myra playing cornet in the background. Their talent was soon recognized, and after an impressive audition they secured work at Tony Pastor's Union Square Theatre, the central hub of New York vaudeville. Gradually, they worked themselves up the comedy ladder, but it was only with the addition of a third member that they reached the big time. That third member was their 5-year-old infant son Buster, who, dressed up in a red wig, a vest, and oversized trousers and shoes, made his stage debut at the Wonderland Theatre in Delaware. For years, the youngster had been constantly disturbing his parents' performances to the point where they had had to tie the boy to a stage pole to ensure such disturbances didn't happen. So, naturally, at least to them, Buster's parents included him in the act to keep an eye on him. Funnily enough, however, it was this strange act of parental supervision that would change everything. A stage show developed whereby Buster, playing the role of an ill-disciplined and rude little tyke, would constantly interrupt his father while he was talking to the audience or attempt to flatten his old man with a basketball. And so, to punish him, Joseph would, with the assistance of a hidden suitcase handle sewn into the boy's back, throw his son around and off the stage. He would even use Buster as a human mop, while Myra played saxophone, the joke being that Buster would always return to the stage unharmed. To modern eyes, this may seem like abuse, but Keaton always insisted that it wasn't, and he was only doing what was natural to him. It was during these early days that the little showman would develop an affectation he would use to great comedy effect later in his film career, that being his deadpan stone-face expression. This came about because he used to sometimes crack a smile on stage to the annoyance of his father who, knowing that maintaining an expressionless face added to the comedy, would strongly whisper the word "face" to stop his son from doing it. By 1901, the Keatons had done so well that they had been featured in a New York newspaper and were performing across the USA. They were now earning the princely sum of $225 a week, allowing them to move into a luxury New York apartment on 21st Street. The family's flourishing fame, however, aroused the suspicions of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, nicknamed the Gerry Society after its founder Elbridge T. Gerry. This was an organization dedicated to rescuing children from the New York underbelly, where they were often forced to work on the streets, in sweatshops, and in the theaters. In this era, child labor laws prohibited minors under the age of 7 from even stepping on stage. Minors under the age of 16 were forbidden to sing, dance, or do anything. Over the next 9 years, Joseph's line of argument was that Buster, as a human stage prop who was tossed around, was technically not doing anything on stage. However, knowing that this was a weak excuse, he promoted rumors that his son was in fact an adult dwarf, an image he cultivated by dressing him up in suits and canes. During these years, when they knew a Gerry agent was in the audience, Joseph made sure to tone down the act. On several occasions, Buster was taken to be examined for bruises, none of which were ever found. One day in November 1907, however, the Gerry Society finally caught up with them. At that time, the three Keatons had become 5 with the birth of Buster's brother Joseph in 1904 and his sister Louise the next year. The new additions only appeared at the end of each show, since they were too young to take part in the main routine. After an evening at the Grand Opera House, Joseph was fined and prohibited from appearing on a New York stage for 2 years. This was a massive career blow, considering that New York was the heart of the American vaudeville movement. The ban forced Joseph and Myra Keaton to take work in the small towns and settlements where they had started. The Keatons thus established a home base in Bluffton in Michigan and returned there every summer when the vaudeville season was over. For the majority of the year, they toured up and down the United States. For the young Buster Keaton, who had up until then been used to moving from place to place, Bluffton became one of the first places he could truly call home. Once back from tour, he would spend the majority of his days hunting, fishing, and duck hunting or playing baseball, which he took as an opportunity to practice his acrobatic skills. One of these, involved flipping head over heels before catching baseballs. When he wasn't showing off his agility, he could be found playing practical jokes, developing a town-wide reputation as a prankster. His favourite targets, or rather audiences, were unsuspecting tourists who didn't know him. It was at this point that Buster's talent for making ingenious mechanical devices for comedy skits would also come to the fore. These were feats he achieved in partnership with his buddy, Ed Gray. The Keatons continued to earn good money and win critical acclaim, but fame would eventually take its toll on the aging Joe Keaton. He was an alcoholic whose drinking was starting to get out of control as Buster neared adulthood. During booze-fueled outbursts, Joe would use his classic high kick to smash anyone who angered him, no matter how small the perceived offence was. Then one night, furious that he was not headlining at the New York Palace, he took his frustration out on the establishment's owner, Martin Beck, a powerful mogul of the vaudeville circuit. Spying him on stage, Beck venomously taunted him with the words, "Okay, Keaton, make me laugh," causing Joe to snap. Leaping at his nemesis, the tubby and alarmed Martin Beck ran away as fast as he could as the elder Keaton gave chase. Afterwards, in response to the incident, the Keatons were banned from every bill in New York, setting in motion a downward spiral from which the group never recovered. Tired of his father's antics, a 21-year-old Buster Keaton took the decision to leave in order to strike out on his own. Returning to New York alone and with the help of his agent, he landed his first solo gig as the star of a Broadway comedy musical called The Passing Show, where he earned $250 a week. Then one day, a chance meeting with an old vaudeville associate, Lou Anger, who had gone into the movie business, changed everything. Keaton's journey to the stratospheric heights of movie stardom began when, at Lou's invitation, he dropped by Colony Studio on East 48th Street to meet the legendary movie producer Joe Schenck and acclaimed comedian Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle, who had been a massive fan of the three Keatons. Asked by Arbuckle to get involved in a skit set in a shop, a nervous Buster declined at first, but changed his mind after a tour of the facility. With the cameras rolling, the debutant took to it like a natural. He complimented his experienced co-star by haplessly and hilariously fumbling his way around the set in a scene that ends with him somersaulting backwards off-screen after being kicked out onto the street. Having witnessed the young man's talent, Arbuckle signed him on the spot for Comique Productions in a partnership of 3 years. This would make Buster Keaton a household name. He would quickly establish himself as a key player of the comique team, with his acrobatic skills put to good use in his first silent comedies, which included The Rough House, Out West, The Bellboy, and The Garage. At the same time as he was developing as an actor on screen, he was also learning about the tricks of the trade behind the screen. This was thanks to Arbuckle, who, ever the mentor, guided him through the editing and filming process behind each production, and Keaton found the power of the camera a revelation. Within 6 months of signing, Keaton had absorbed so much that he was comfortably directing the scenes starring Arbuckle, the pair having become best friends after closely working together on multiple projects. In 1918, the Comique Collective left New York, to move to Long Beach, California. Now, following in their son's footsteps, Buster's parents relocated there as well. Joe Keaton, who had initially been skeptical of the new medium of film, was to eventually feature in 4 productions. In the summer of 1918, Keaton's career was put on hold for a short while following America's entry into World War I, as national duty became his most important priority. After training at Long Island, he was sent to France, where he served as an army cryptographer, a job that involved sending messages and orders in Morse code. Throughout his service, the cold, wet conditions he endured as a result of camping outside caused a persistent ear infection. He would never fully recover from this, and it was this infection which would make the silent actor hard of hearing for the rest of his days. On one occasion, his disability almost cost him his life when, returning from a card game, he failed to respond to the challenges issued by a sentry on watch. Buster's skin was only saved when the loud click of a shell being loaded compelled him to shout, "Friend!" in the nick of time. By the time of the armistice and the end of hostilities, he had not only been promoted to corporal, but had been lucky enough to never set foot in a single trench. As the victorious American troops patiently waited for transport home across the Atlantic, Buster offered his talents to his division's entertainment troupe called the Sunshine Players. His performances lengthened his stay. Because he was so popular with the soldiers, he was ordered to stay another 4 months to provide entertainment. Following his return to the USA, Buster dived back into the fledgling film industry, which had now firmly laid down its roots in Hollywood. Turning down 2 $1,000 a week offers, he rejoined Comique Productions for the lesser sum of $250 a week out of loyalty to its production manager, Joe Schenck, who had financially supported his family throughout the war. Working 6 days a week, Keaton dedicated himself once again to his craft all the way up to the film The Garage, which, released in 1920, would be his last with Comique and Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. The iconic duo, still the best of pals, would split up when Roscoe expressed his desire to leave behind the two-reel comedy formula in order to move into longer comedy feature films. With the superstar of Comique Productions gone, Joe Schenck gave his co-star a big promotion. At the end of 1919, Keaton signed a contract which stipulated he would make 8 two-reeler comedies a year as the creative head of the newly formed production unit, Buster Keaton Productions. It was here that some of the most celebrated comedy masterpieces of the 1920s would be made. With the ink on the contract barely dry, the following January, Keaton began filming The High Sign, the first two-reeler of his independent era. This was a movie that would set the tone for much of the rest of his filmography with its mechanical humor. Keaton would continue to build upon the film's mechanical foundations with the release of a series of critically acclaimed shorts between 1920 to 1923. Taking inspiration from a 1919 Ford Motor Company documentary about prefabricated houses, in 1 week he would relentlessly mock the industrial optimism of the early 20s by having a freshly married couple arriving at their new home, only for them to find out that it was in fact a house in a box they would have to assemble themselves, IKEA style. Having created 5 films in 1920, the next year began with the same feverish intensity with the release of Hard Luck. This, featured a daredevil maneuver in which Buster performs an off-balance jump into a swimming pool that is concealed with wax paper to make it seem as if it was a solid surface. Delighted by the uproarious laughter of the audience in the movie theatre, which persisted even as the credits rolled, Buster would later claim it was the greatest laugh he ever got. Buster's hit-making streak, however, would be put on temporary pause when, during the shooting of The Electric House, he fell 10 feet to the ground after getting his ankle caught and broken in a prop escalator. During his 2 months of convalescence, Buster would make the ultimate proposal to his on-off lover, Natalie Talmadge, the sister of movie stars Norma and Constance Talmadge, who he had met while she was a secretary at Comique Productions. According to his biography, Keaton claimed a lonely Natalie had sent him a letter from New York in which she informed him she would drop everything to be with him. This compelled him to travel there and make her his wife. After marrying his sweetheart on the 31st of May 1921 in a private ceremony in New York, the couple took the train back to Los Angeles the next day so Buster could resume his busy work schedule. By this point, he had been away from filming for 4 months, and so he embarked on his most technically ambitious project to date, the Playhouse. In this feature, multiple versions of Buster, up to 9 at once and dressed in various costumes and drag, appeared on screen. With his career reaching dizzying heights and having moved into an enormous 20-room mansion complete with a ballroom, swimming pool, celebrity neighbours and a personal butler, Buster prepared himself for a new chapter with his wife Natalie, who was heavily pregnant around the spring of 1922. This was around the same time that a work many would call his magnum opus, Cops, was doing the rounds in the picture houses. In a groundbreaking piece of cinematic choreography, he is chased by hundreds of cops after lighting his cigarette with the lit fuse of a bomb, which he then casually throws into a police parade. Off the back of this professional success, Buster enjoyed a personal triumph with the birth of his son, James, Jimmy Talmadge Keaton, on the 2nd of June 1922. In 1923, just like his mentor Arbuckle had done, Keaton moved away from the tried and tested comedy two-reeler with its narrative limitations and into extended feature films that gave him more storytelling freedom, finishing his two-reeler era with the rather mediocre Love Nest, the end product of a growing boredom with the format. He negotiated another deal that would require him to create 2 features a year. This was a development that echoed the wider industry migration spearheaded by Charlie Chaplin and others towards the new type of filmmaking. Similarly to how he had ridiculed the Ford Motor Company's prefabricated house documentary in 1 week, Buster started his feature career by mocking the 1916 film Intolerance, a study of poverty throughout history. In The 3 Ages, he turned the paradigm on its head by focusing on love in the Stone Age, the Roman Age, and the Modern Age. His next effort, Our Hospitality, is interesting because it signified an artistic shift away from pure comedy and towards something fringing on the dramatic. The New York Times declared that this more sophisticated and generally well-received movie, which outperformed The 3 Ages at the box office, was a sign that plotless comedy was dying. Behind the adulation, however, things were not quite as perfect at home. Following the birth of his second child, Robert Bobby Talmadge Keaton, on the 3rd of February 1924, Natalie had begun sleeping in the guest room of their lofty mansion. Relations between the couple, who had discovered they were like chalk and cheese, had deteriorated due to a combination of her lavish spending and her insistence on moving to fancier and fancier houses. This conflicted with her husband's preference for a simple life. Yet it was in this atmosphere of fraught marital tensions that Buster would make one of his most beloved classics. Sherlock Jr. stars Buster's father, Joe Keaton, as well as Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, whose career had flatlined after a woman had been found dead at one of his parties. Sherlock Jr. is noteworthy because, while swinging on a rope off a moving train for a stunt, Buster cracked his neck on a railroad track. The gravity of the injury only became apparent years later, when a doctor told him that he had a broken neck. Keaton's next boundary-pushing project started with the leasing of a nearly 9,000-ton ocean liner, SS Buford, a veteran of World War I. This provided the ocean-borne setting of his follow-up, The Navigator. With a crew of 60, comprised of a mixture of movie and sailing crew as well as one Captain John O'Brien, Buster spent 10 weeks at sea making his film. During this time, he nearly suffocated twice while filming underwater scenes in a bulky diving suit. These near-death experiences, however, would have a silver lining when The Navigator would go on to become Keaton Studios' biggest ever financial success. His next film, 7 Chances, was about a man who needs to get married by 7 p.m. that day to receive a $7 million inheritance. Following on from this, he began planning his next effort, Go West, where he would play a sad, lonely Midwestern youth who strikes up an unlikely friendship with a cow named Brown Eyes. Shot in the scorching Arizona desert, which was so hot the cameras had to be padded with ice to keep them functioning, production was initially delayed by 2 weeks because his bow